Good evening, everyone. Thank you for getting on the stream this evening. Shout out to Gail. Shout out to Abdul. Thank you for getting on the stream again for another episode of Let's Talk About It Now. For those of you that come into the stream late, please do me the courtesy of supporting the stream by hitting the subscribe button, hitting the share button, to show your support for the content of which we will be sharing tonight. Again, this is in celebration. This is a continuation of the celebration of Dr. Martin Luther King. I found it only fitting as we come to the end of this day to finish it off with what became his last speech. Again, like I said in the previous stream earlier today, I mentioned that most, and sadly, to my sad regret, most individuals, especially now in this particular generation, are very unaware, uninformed as to who and what Martin Luther King actually represented. You would be amazed. He was much bigger than the I Have a Dream speech. The I Have a Dream speech was done at an earlier in the earlier years before his unfortunate assassination, and up until the point where he was unfortunately assassinated, his thoughts, his views, his ideas had changed drastically in so many different ways. Though he still stood behind the aspirations of nonviolence, yes. Though he still stood behind the same desire to see us all come together unified, regardless of race, creed, or culture, regardless of religious persuasion. Those ideas and those ideals still stood firm with him, even up to his assassination. However, he began to see the fight for justice, the fight for human rights, the fight against racism, and the fight against violent protests. He found a different perspective by which to look at the struggle and what was needed and what was necessary to be done. Many in the power structure found his new ideas, his new ideals to be threatening. Because I will tell you this, folks, if you think for 1 second that Martin Luther King was assassinated because he had a dream, you have a really misunderstanding about who this man truly was. Because I'll tell you this, if he was this docile, non-violent individual that the media tends to paint Martin Luther King as, you have to ask yourself a question. Why do they want him dead? Why would they want a man like that gone? If he was so non-threatening, if he was simply standing on the principle of nonviolence, simply telling black folk to disarm themselves in the face of violence, and to embrace the same individuals that was inflicting this violence upon them, even to the point of taking lives. If this is who he was, why would you seek to take the life of an individual like that? You would think an individual like that is very non-threatening. In fact, they pose no threat at all. So it stands true to say that there had to be something more to Dr. Martin Luther King that made the status quo feel threatened, that made the powers that be feel threatened enough to want to remove this individual from the public permanently. permanently. Oh yeah, Martin Luther King did not find himself in a position where he was violently attacked, thrown into prison, brutally abused multiple times throughout his entire struggle for civil rights and human rights. He was not assassinated again because he had a dream. In fact, I would say he was assassinated because he found out that his dream had in fact turned into a nightmare. We're going to get into it tonight. I wanted to close this night off tonight in celebration of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. by highlighting his very last sermon, his very last speech within 24 hours of his assassination. And again, I thank all of you for getting on the stream tonight. To all my moderators, if you can hear my voice clearly, for all the sound is perfect, and we can get right into this, I want you to put a 1 in the chat room. Put a 1 in the chat room for me if you can hear me clear, and if the sound is perfect, we can get right into it. Awesome. Thank you, Gail. Again, as you come into the room, as you come into the building, hit that subscribe button, hit the share button. Let's get this information out. Let's celebrate a man who's worth celebrating. You know, I think we celebrate too many things that are not even worth celebrating. We spend an inordinate amount of time celebrating individuals and things that don't even deserve your time. But this is what we have been dumbed down to today. That we celebrate everything, regardless of whether it's built on principle, regardless of whether it's built on any sound principle. We just celebrate anything. So I would hope that we would be excited about celebrating a man who not only sacrificed his entire life to give us many of the rights that we celebrate today, that we enjoy today, but it came with a price. It came with a price, and I mean an expensive price. Many lost their lives on both sides, black and white, in this fight for civil rights and human rights, walking side by side, shoulder to shoulder, arms locked with Dr. King and many others that supported the civil rights movement, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and many other organizations that stood side by side, hand in hand with Martin Luther King, putting their lives also at risk. I would hope that we would find some excitement in celebrating a man who sacrificed his own life and sacrificed his children, sacrificed the presence of being in his own wife's presence, his family's presence. Because you know today, most people, they would rather, in most cases, simply go to themselves, focus on themselves, focus on their own family, their personal family. They stand for no cause outside of their own home. I've heard many people say to me many times that if it's not affecting my house, if it's not affecting my family, then I don't really concern myself. Well, I think that's the ultimate selfish viewpoint. But here's a man who did not have that kind of viewpoint, and he had a viewpoint of activism. He had a viewpoint to concern himself about those that could not defend themselves, even at an early age, while he was in his early 20s. Again, you have to understand that Martin Luther King was assassinated at the tender age of 39. That's young. 39 years of age, he was assassinated. But prior to turning 39, he had done so much. He had written 5 books, graduated from college with honors, and had also received the Nobel Peace Prize, the youngest recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize ever. in this country to receive such an award. He was busy at a very early, young age. And I believe, and to my sad regret, this is one of the things that is missing in our communities today. It's almost non-existent. You can hardly find a young man in their early 20s that's even concerned about anything bigger than themselves. You could barely find it today. It's almost, as I said, non-existent. So I want to end this night in celebrating a man who is worth celebrating. I can't even give him the celebration that he absolutely deserves in this one stream. But I do my part to give honor to a man that deserves honor, to give respect to a man that deserves respect, and to give insight to those that have no clue of who this man really was outside of I Have a Dream speech. So again, I thank you all for getting on the stream tonight. I won't be long, but I do intend to be strong on this stream tonight as we close out the celebration for Dr. Martin Luther King. I want to read first a bio, and again, I'm sharing my screen just as a backdrop to kind of give a little clarity as to who he was. Martin Luther King Jr. This is taken from a Britannica article. It goes on to say, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., original name Michael King Jr. Many didn't know his first name was Michael originally by birth. He later changed his name to Martin. Born January the 15th, 1929 in Atlanta, Georgia. Died, or I should say assassinated, because you know there is a difference, April 4th, 1968. In Memphis, Tennessee, Baptist minister and social activist who led the civil rights movement in the United States from the mid-1950s until his death by assassination in 1968. His leadership was fundamental to that movement's success in ending the legal segregation of African Americans in the South and other parts of the United States. And let me say this, he ended legal segregation as segregation was a law. We saw the videos, many of us. For those of us that were not alive during that time, we seen the videos. We saw the clips of how things were back then. You had fire hydrants. You had water fountains that were labeled colored whites only. You had bathroom facilities that were labeled color or blacks only. We couldn't go into restaurants, public restaurants. We couldn't sit at the front of the bus. We had to sit at the back of the bus. School systems were segregated entirely, and it was illegal for a black student to go to a white predominant school. This is what legal segregation looked like under what's known as Jim Crow law. In a country like this, it's hard to believe today, with the illusion of inclusion that we find ourselves experiencing today with some of the pockets of success as it relates to the black community, where we have celebrities that are successful, singers, R&B artists, rap artists, athletes in basketball and football and many other sports, where so much success is shown and seen, so much money is made as a result of these particular genres. And still yet, these kind of laws existed on the books in the good old USA. I just wanted to say that. Again, it goes on to say that segregation was ended on a legal standpoint. as it related to African Americans in the South and other parts of the United States. King rose to national prominence as head of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which promoted nonviolent tactics such as the massive March on Washington in 1963 to achieve civil rights. He was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964. In the early years, King came from a comfortable middle-class family steeped in the tradition of the Southern Black ministry. Both his father and maternal grandfather were Baptist preachers. His parents were college educated, and King's father had succeeded his father-in-law as pastor of the prestigious Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta. The family lived in Auburn Avenue, otherwise known as Sweet Auburn, the bustling Black Wall Street, home to some of the country's largest and most prosperous black businesses and black churches in the years before the Civil Rights Movement. Young Martin received a solid education and grew up in a loving extended family. This secure upbringing, however, did not prevent King from experiencing the prejudices then common in the South. He never forgot the time when at the age of 6, one of his white playmates announced that his parents would no longer allow him to play with King because the children were now attending segregated schools. Dearest to King in these early years was his maternal grandmother, whose death in 1941 left him shaken and unstable, upset because he had learned of her fatal heart attack while attending a parade without his parents' permission. The 12-year-old King attempted suicide by jumping from a second-story window. In 1944, at the age of 15, King entered Morehouse College in Atlanta under a special wartime program intended to boost enrollment by admitting promising high school students like King. Before beginning college, however, King spent the summer on a tobacco farm in Connecticut. It was his first extended stay away from home and his first substantial experience of race relations outside the segregated South. He was shocked by how peaceful the races mixed in the North. Negroes and whites go to the same church, he noted in a letter to his parents. I never thought that a person of my race could eat anywhere. This summer experience in the North only deepened King's growing hatred of racial segregation. At Morehouse, King favored studies in medicine and law, but these were eclipsed in his senior year by a decision to enter the ministry. As his father had urged, King's mentor at the Morehouse was the college president, Benjamin Mays, a social gospel activist whose rich oratory and progressive ideas had left an indelible imprint on King's father. Committed to fighting racial inequality, Mays accused the African American community of complacency in the face of oppression, and he prodded the black church into social action by criticizing its emphasis on the hereafter instead of the here and now. It was a call to service that was not lost on the teenage King. He graduated from Morehouse in 1948. King spent the next 3 years at Crozier Theological Seminary in Chester, Pennsylvania, where he became acquainted with Mohandas Gandhi's philosophy of nonviolence, as well as with the thought of contemporary Protestant theologians. He earned a Bachelor of Divinity degree in 1951. Renowned for his oratorical skills, King was elected president of Crozier's student body, which was composed almost exclusively of white students. As a professor at Crozier wrote in a letter of recommendation for King, the fact that with our student body largely Southern in constitution, a colored man should be elected to and be popular in such position is in itself no means recommendation. From Crozier, King went to Boston University, where in seeking a firm foundation for his own theological and ethical inclinations, is a point to be tagged. He studies man's relationships to God and received a doctorate in 1955 for a dissertation titled a comparison of the conception of God in the thinking of Paul Tillich and Henry Nelson Wyman. The Montgomery boycott of Martin Luther King. While in Boston, King met Coretta Scott, a native Alabamian who was studying at the New England Conservatory of Music. They were married in 1953 and had 4 children. King had been pastor of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama, slightly more than a year when the city's small group of civil rights activists decided to contest racial segregation on the city's public bus system following the incident on December 1st, 1955, in which Rosa Parks, an African-American woman who had refused to surrender her bus seat to a white passenger, and as a consequence was arrested for violating the city's segregation law. Activists formed the Montgomery Improvement Association to boycott the transit system and chose King as their leader. He had the advantage of being a young, well-trained man who was too new in town to have been made enemies. He was generally respected, and it was thought that his family connection and professional standing would enable him to find another pastorate should the boycott fail. In his first speech to the group as its president, King declared, "We have no alternative but to protest. For many years we have shown an amazing patience. We have sometimes given our white brothers the feeling that we liked the way they were being treated, like the way we were being treated. But we come here tonight to be saved from that patience that makes us patient with anything less than freedom and justice." These words introduced to the country a fresh voice, a skillful rhetoric, an inspiring personality, and in time, a dynamic new doctrine of civil struggle. Although King's home was dynamited and his family's safety threatened, he continued to lead the boycott until 1 year and a few weeks later, the city buses were desegregated. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference, recognizing the need for a mass movement to capitalize on the successful Montgomery action, King set about organizing the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which gave him a base of operations throughout the South as well as a national platform from which to speak. King lectured in all parts of the country and discussed race-related issues with religion and civil rights leaders at home and abroad. In February of 1959, he and his party were warmly received by India's Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, and others, as the result of a brief discussion with followers of Gandhi about the Gandhian concept of peaceful non-compliance. King became increasingly convinced that nonviolent resistance was the most potent weapon available to oppressed people in their struggle for freedom. King also looked to Africa for inspiration. The liberation struggle in Africa has been the greatest single international influence on American Negro students, he wrote. "Frequently, I hear them say that if their African brothers can break the bonds of colonialism, surely the American Negro can break Jim Crow." In 1960, King and his family moved to his native city of Atlanta, where he became co-pastor with his father of the Ebenezer Baptist Church. At this post, he devoted most of his time to the SCLC, which is the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and the Civil Rights Movement, declaring that the psychological movement has come when a concentrated drive against injustice can bring great tangible gains. His thesis was soon tested as he agreed to support the sit-in demonstrations undertaken by local black college students. In late October, he was arrested with 33 young people protesting segregation at the lunch counter in Atlanta department store. Charges were dropped, but King was sentenced to Reedsville State Prison Farm on the pretext that he had violated his probation on a minor traffic offense committed several months earlier. Wow. The level of wickedness. The case assumed national proportions, with widespread concern over his safety, outrage at Georgia's flouting of legal forms and the failure of President Dwight D. Eisenhower to intervene. King was released only upon the intercession of Democratic president candidate John F. Kennedy, an action so widely publicized that it was felt to have contributed substantially to Kennedy's slender election victory 8 days later. In the years from 1960 to 1965, King's influence reached its zenith. Handsome, eloquent, doggedly determined, King quickly caught the attention of the news media, particularly of the producers of that budding medium of social change, television. He understood the power of television to nationalize and internationalize the struggle for civil rights, as his well-publicized antics, nonviolent sit-ins, protest marches aroused the devoted allegiance of many African Americans and liberal whites in all parts of the country, as well as support from the administration of President Kennedy and Lyndon B. Johnson. But there were also notable failures, as in Albany, Georgia, 1961 to 1962, when King and his colleagues failed to achieve their desegregation goals for public parks and other facilities. The letter for the Birmingham jail of Martin Luther King Jr. In Birmingham, Alabama, in the spring of 1963, King's campaign to end segregation at lunch counters and in hiring practices drew nationwide attention. When police turned dogs and fire hoses on the demonstrators, King was jailed along with large numbers of his supporters, including hundreds of school children. His supporters did not, however, include all the black clergy of Birmingham, and he was strongly opposed by some of the white clergy, who had issued a statement urging African Americans not to support the demonstration. From the Birmingham jail, King wrote a letter of great eloquence in which he spelled out his philosophy of nonviolence. You may well ask, why direct action? Why sit-ins, marches, and so forth? Isn't negotiation a better path? You are quite right in calling for negotiation. Indeed, this is the very purpose of direct action. Nonviolence, direct action, seeks to create such a crisis and foster such a tension that a community which has constantly refused to negotiate is forced to confront the issue. Near the end of the Birmingham campaign, in an effort to draw together the multiple forces for peaceful change and dramatic to the country and to the world the importance of solving the U.S. racial problem, King joined other civil rights leaders in organizing the historic March on Washington on August 28, 1963. An interracial assembly of more than 200,000 gathered peaceably in the shadow of the Lincoln Memorial to demand equal justice for all citizens under the law. Here the crowds were uplifted by the emotional strength and prophetic quality of King's famous "I Have a Dream" speech, in which he emphasized his faith that all men someday would be brothers. The rising tide of civil rights agitation produced, as King had hoped, and a strong effect on national opinion, and resulted in the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, authorizing the federal government to enforce desegregation of public accommodations and outlawing discrimination in public-owned facilities, as well as in employment. That eventful year was climaxed by the award to King of the Nobel Peace Prize in Oslo in December. I accept this award today with an abiding faith in America and an audacious faith in the future of mankind, said King in his acceptance speech. I refuse to accept the idea that the isness of man's present nature makes him morally incapable of reaching up for the eternal outness that forever confronts him. Challenges of the final years of Martin Luther King. The first signs of opposition to King's antics from within the civil rights movement surfaced during the March of 1965, demonstrating in Selma, Alabama, which were aimed at dramatizing the need for a federal voting rights law that would provide legal support for the enfranchisement of African Americans in the South. King organized an initial march from Selma to the state capitol building in Montgomery, but did not lead it himself. the marchers were turned back by state troopers with nightsticks and tear gas. He was determined to lead a second march despite injunctions by a federal court and efforts from Washington to persuade him to cancel it. Heading the procession of 1,500 marchers, black and white, he set out across Pettus Bridge outside Selma until the group came to a barricade of state troopers. But instead of going on and forcing a confrontation, he led his followers to kneel in prayer and then unexpectedly turned back. This decision cost King the support of many young radicals who were already faulting him for being too cautious. The suspicion of an arrangement with federal and local authorities, vigorously but not entirely convincingly denied, clung to the Selma affair. The country was nevertheless aroused, resulting in the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Throughout the nation, impatient with the lack of great substantive progress, encouraged the growth of black militancy. Especially in the slums of the large northern cities, King's religious philosophy of nonviolence was increasingly questioned. The rioting in the Watts district of Los Angeles in August of 1965 demonstrated the depth of unrest among urban African Americans. In an effort to meet the challenge of the ghetto, King and his forces initiated a drive against racial discrimination in Chicago. At the beginning of the following year, the chief target was to be segregation in housing. After a spring and summer of rallies, marches, and demonstrations, an arrangement was signed between the city and coalition of African American liberals and labor organizations calling for various measures to enforce the existing laws and regulations with respect to housing. But this agreement was to have little effect. The impression remained that King's Chicago campaign was nullified partly because of the opposition of that city's powerful mayor, then Richard J. Daley, and partly because of the unexpected complexities of northern racism. In Illinois and Mississippi, alike, King was now being challenged and even publicly derided by young black power enthusiasts. Whereas King stood for patience, middle-class respectability, and a measured approach to social change, the sharp-tongued, blue-jean-clad young urban radical stood for confrontation and immediate change. In the latter eyes, the suit-wearing, calm-spoken civil rights leader was irresponsibly passive and old beyond his years. King was in his 30s, more a member of the other side of the generation gap than their revolutionary leader at that time, Malcolm X. Malcolm X went so far as to call King's tactics criminal. Concerning nonviolence, it is criminal to teach a man not to defend himself when he is in constant victim of brutal attacks. In the face of mounting criticism, King broadened his approach to include concerns other than racism. On April 4th, 1967 at Riverside Church in New York City, and again on the 15th at a Monmouth Peace rally in the city, he committed himself irrevocably to opposing U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War. Once before, in early January of 1966, he had condemned the war, but official outrage from Washington and strenuous opposition within the black community itself had caused him to relent. He next sought to widen his base by forming a coalition of the poor of all races that would address itself to economic problems such as poverty and unemployment. It was a version of populism, seeking to enroll janitors, hospital workers, seasonal laborers, and the destitute of Appalachia, along with the student militant and pacifist intellectuals. His endeavors along these lines, however, did not engender much support in any segment of the population. Meanwhile, the strain and changing dynamics of the civil rights movement had taken a toll on King, especially in the final months of his life. "I'm frankly tired of marching. I'm tired of going to jail," he admitted in 1968. "Living every day under the threat of death. I feel discouraged every now and then, and I feel my works are in vain. But then the Holy Spirit revives my soul again." King's plan for a Poor People's March to Washington were interrupted in the spring of 1968 by a trip to Memphis, Tennessee, in support of a strike by the city's sanitation workers. In the opinion of many of his followers and biographers, King seemed to sense his end was near. As King prophetically told the crowd at the Mason Temple Church in Memphis on April 3rd, the night before he died, "I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land." The next day, while standing on the second-story balcony of the Lorraine Motel, where he and his associates were staying, King was killed by a sniper's bullet. The killing sparked riots and disturbances in over 100 cities across the country. On March the 10th of 1969, the accused assassin, a white man by the name of James Earl Ray, pleaded guilty to the murder and was sentenced to 99 years in prison. Ray later recanted his confession, claiming lawyers had coerced him into confessing and that he was the victim of a conspiracy. In a surprising turn of events, members of the King family eventually came to Ray's defense. King's son, Dexter, met with reputed assassin in March of 1997 and then publicly joined Ray's plea for reopening of his case. When Ray died on April 23rd of 1998, Coretta Scott King declared, "America will never have the benefit of Mr. Ray's trial," which would have produced new revelations about the assassination, as well as established the facts concerning Mr. Ray's innocence. Although the United States government conducted several investigations into the murder of King and each time concluded that Ray was the sole assassin, the killing remains a matter of controversy. I'm going to stop there, folks. I wanted to give a backdrop and I wanted to give some clear information as to the extraordinary sacrifice that Dr. King made in his life. You know, I think it's worth reviewing more often than not. I don't know, and I will tell you, I don't know how much emphasis is put on the true Dr. King. I'm not talking about the I Have a Dream Dr. King. No. That's the Dr. King that society would love you to keep replaying over and over inside your head. And as long as society only knows the I Have a Dream Dr. King, they'll never know the true things that he fought for. He fought for more than just equality of the races. He fought for more than just segregation. He fought for more than just getting the privilege of black people to sit at the counters at a restaurant. He stood for more than just being able to sit and remain seated on a bus. He stood for more than just being able to use a public restroom. He stood for more than just being able to go to a public school and sit next to a person who may not reflect your color, who may not share your reflection. He represented so much more than that. So much more than that. And I'll tell you something, it really irritates me that a man who spent his life, paid the ultimate sacrifice, and unfortunately lost his life for so much more than what the media would make the public believe he stood for. I believe, as I've always said in other streams, evil men thrive, and evil thrives when good men, good women say nothing. I believe that every life has an obligation to justify itself. Justify your existence. Why are you here? Why are you here? Who will remember you when you're physically gone? What did you stand for? What were you willing to stand for? In the face of opposition, what were you willing to stand for? In the face of pushback, What were you willing to stand for in the face of not being looked at as popular? What were you willing to stand for? I believe the whole spirit of sacrifice has been sucked out of the population today, especially as it relates to young people. There is no more urge, no more desire. It's as though we believe there is nothing else to fight for. As if the struggle is over. As if real, true justice has been realized. I don't think so. Whatever community you live in, look around your community. You tell me if true justice is realized. When you have poor educational systems. When you have no programs that are financed with the millions and millions of dollars of resources that they could use to develop programs in the communities where you live, where we live, where our children would have something productive to do and to spend their time doing, as opposed to spending their time doing destructive behavior. I've said many times the devil's workshop is an idle mind. If you have nothing to do, nothing productive to pursue, no aim, no purpose, the only thing can come from that is destructive behavior. And that's irregardless of what your nationality is. That's why in other communities outside of the black community, you find a slew of programs available as early as elementary school years, all the way up into high school years. And even then, they're prepared with programs that adequately prepare them for college. To my sad regret, these programs are not available all too often in low-income areas. Why? When millions of dollars is spent annually in law enforcement, purchasing cars and cruisers and bullets and bulletproof vests. All of the things to address destructive behavior, but no programs to curtail destructive behavior. I don't think the dream has been realized. I think Dr. King realized the nightmare was closely approaching. I think he knew that. What I want to do tonight in this stream, as we close out the celebration of a king, as we close out the celebration of a king, I want to make the listeners, those of you that are watching this stream, if you have not hit that share button, if you have not hit that subscribe button, please hit it. Not because I asked you to. If you don't choose to hit it, don't. But for those of you that are like-minded, I appreciate your support. Hit the share button, hit the like button, so we can keep content like this that's relevant, that's not silly, that has no foundation to it whatsoever. This is Let's Talk About It Now Uncensored, where we will talk about controversial subjects and issues. Only like-minded ones will enjoy this kind of content. So again, hit the subscribe button, hit the share button. Let's get this information out. I want to make those of you that are not aware of a speech that he made within 24 hours of his assassination. You probably never heard it. Many of you have, but so many I know have not, because if you ask the average person about Martin Luther King, the first thing they come up with is, oh, that's the guy that did the I Have a Dream speech. Yeah. That's the speech that the powers that be promote. That's the speech that media promotes, because they want to paint a narrative that this man only had one goal in mind. And what was that one goal? So that all of us, regardless of race, would just come together and be brothers. Really? How can two walk together lest they agree? How can two walk together in harmony unless they agree? There were so many issues that had to be addressed, and he addressed each and every issue. So many issues outside of I Have a Dream. And after countless speeches, traveling up and down the country, under the threat of losing his own life, threats to his wife, house being firebombed, phones being tapped, every hotel that he booked into, those phones were tapped. He was followed along the highways and byways as he went about his travels. He was being tailed by FBI, tailed by COINTELPRO. Hated. He could not have simply been a man reduced to simply a I Have a Dream speech. There was so much more to Dr. Martin Luther King. I want to share a few minutes of what was so different and how much bigger he was as opposed to what the public would make you believe he represented. Let's get into it. This is the very last speech he made within 24 hours of his assassination.
And his eloquent and generous introduction, and then thought about myself, I wondered who he was talking about. It's always good to have your closest friend and associate to say something good about you. And Ralph Abernathy is the best friend that I have in the world. I'm delighted to see each of you here tonight in spite of a storm warning. You reveal that you are determined to go on anyhow. Something is happening in Memphis, something is happening in our world. And you know, if I was standing at the beginning of time with the possibility of taking a kind of general and panoramic view of the whole of human history up to now, and the Almighty said to me, Martin Luther King, which age would you like to live in? I would take my mental flight by Egypt, and I would watch God's children in their magnificent trek from the dark dungeons of Egypt through, or rather across the Red Sea, through the wilderness on toward the Promised Land. And in spite of its magnificence, I wouldn't stop there. I would move on by Greece and take my mind to Mount Olympus. And I would see Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, Euripides, and Aristophanes assemble around the Parthenon. And I would watch them around the Parthenon as they discussed the great and eternal issues of reality, but I wouldn't stop there. I would go on even to the great heyday of the Roman Empire. And I would see developments around there through various emperors and leaders, but I wouldn't stop there. I would even come up to the day of the Renaissance and get a quick picture of all that the Renaissance did for the cultural and aesthetic life of man, but I wouldn't stop there. I would even go by the way that the man for whom I'm named had his habitat. And I would watch Martin Luther as he tacks his 95 Theses on the door at the Church of Wittenberg, but I wouldn't stop there. I would come on up even to 1863 and watch a vacillating president by the name of Abraham Lincoln finally come to the conclusion that he had to sign the Emancipation Proclamation, but I wouldn't stop there. I would even come up to the early 30s and see a man grappling with the problems of the bankruptcy of his nation, and come with an eloquent cry that we have nothing to fear but fear itself. But I wouldn't stop there. Strangely enough, I would turn to the Almighty and say, if you allow me to live just a few years in the second half of the 20th century, I will be happy. Now, that's a strange statement to make because the world is all messed up. The nation is sick. Trouble is in the land, confusion all around. That's a strange statement. But I know somehow that only when it is dark enough can you see the stars. And I see God working in this period of the 20th century in a way that men in some strange way are responding. Something is happening in our world. The masses of people are rising up, and wherever they are assembled today, whether they are in Johannesburg, South Africa, Nairobi, Kenya, Accra, Ghana, New York City, Atlanta, Georgia, Jackson, Mississippi, or Memphis, Tennessee, the cry is always the same: we want to be free. And another reason that I'm happy to live in this period is that we have been forced to a point where we are going to have to grapple with the problems that men have been trying to grapple with through history, but the demands didn't force them to do it. Survival demands that we grapple with them. Men for years now have been talking about war and peace, but now no longer can they just talk about it. It is no longer the choice between violence and nonviolence in this world. Is nonviolence or non-existence. That is where we are today. And also in the human rights revolution, if something isn't done and done in a hurry to bring the colored peoples of the world out of their long years of poverty, their long years of hurt and neglect, the whole world is doomed. Now, I'm just happy that God has allowed me to live in this period to see what is unfolding. And I'm happy that he's allowed me to be in Memphis. I can remember when Negroes were just going around, as Ralph has said, so often scratching where they didn't itch and laughing when they were not tickled. But that day is all over.
I think they're back to doing it.
We're in business now, and we are determined to gain our rightful place in God's world.
Man, oh man.
And that's all this whole thing is about. We aren't engaged in any negative protest and in any negative arguments with anybody. We are saying that we are determined to be men. We are determined to be people. We are saying that we are God's children. And if we are God's children, we don't have to live like we are forced to live. Now, what does all of this mean in this great period of history? It means that we've got to stay together. We've got to stay together and maintain unity. You know, whenever Pharaoh wanted to prolong the period of slavery in Egypt, he had a favorite formula for doing it. What was that? He kept the slaves fighting among themselves.
Wow. Wow.
But whenever the slaves get together, something happens in Pharaoh's court, and he cannot hold the slaves in slavery. When the slaves get together, that's the beginning of getting out of slavery. Now let us maintain unity. Secondly, let us keep the issues where they are. The issue is injustice. The issue is the refusal of Memphis to be fair and honest in its dealings with its public servants who happen to be sanitation workers.
That's right. Fair use.
Now, we've got to keep attention on that. That's always the problem with a little violence. You know what happened the other day, and the press dealt only with the window breaking. I read the articles. They very seldom got around to mentioning the fact that 1,300 sanitation workers are on strike, and that Memphis is not being fair to them, and that Mayor Loeb is in dire need of a doctor. They didn't get around to that. Now we're going to march again, and we've got to march again in order to put the issue where it is supposed to be. And force everybody to see the there are 1,300 of God's children here suffering. Sometimes going hungry, going through dark and dreary nights, wondering how this thing is going to come out. That's the issue. And we've got to say to the nation, we know how it's coming out. But when people get caught up with that which is right and they are willing to sacrifice for it, there is no stopping point short of victory. We aren't going to let any may stop us. We are masters in our nonviolent movement in disarming police forces. They don't know what to do. I've seen them so often. I remember in Birmingham, Alabama, when we were in that majestic struggle there. We would move out of the 16th Street Baptist Church day after day. By the hundreds we would move out, and Bull Connor would tell them to send the dogs forth. And they did come. But we just went before the dogs singing, ain't gonna let nobody turn me around.
Yes, sir.
Bull Connor next would say, turn the fire hoses on. As I said to you the other night, Bull Connor didn't know history. He knew a kind of physics that somehow didn't relate to the transphysics that we knew about. And that was the fact that there was a certain kind of fire that no water could put out. And we went before the fire hoses. We had known water. If we were Baptists or some other denomination, we had been immersed. If we were Methodists and some others, we had been sprinkled, but we knew water. That couldn't stop us. And we just went on before the dogs, and we would look at them, and we'd go on before the water hoses, and we would look at it, and we just go on singing, over my head I see freedom in the air. And then we would be thrown into paddy wagons, and sometimes we were stacked in there like sardines in a can.
Yeah.
They would throw us in, and old Bull would say, take them off. And they did, and we would just go on in the paddy wagon singing, we shall overcome. And every now and then we'd get in jail, and we'd see the jailers looking through the windows, being moved by our prayer, and being moved by our words in our song. And there was a power there which Bull Connor couldn't adjust to. And so we ended up transforming Bull into a steel, and we won our struggle in Birmingham. Now, we've got to go on in Memphis just like that. I call upon you to be with us when we go out Monday. Now about injunction. We have an injunction, and we're going into court tomorrow morning to fight this illegal, unconstitutional injunction. All we say to America is be true to what you said on paper.
That's it. Be true to what you put on paper. That's it.
If I lived in China or even Russia or any totalitarian country, maybe I could understand some of these illegal injunctions. Maybe I could understand the denial of certain basic First Amendment privileges because they haven't committed themselves to that over there. But somewhere I read of the freedom of assembly. Somewhere I read
That's right.
of the freedom of speech. Somewhere I read of the freedom of press. Somewhere I read that the greatness of America is the right to protest for rights. So just as I said, we aren't going to let any dogs or water hoses turn us around. We aren't going to let any injunction turn us around.
Yes, sir. That's Dr. King.
We are going on. We need all of you. You know what's beautiful to me? Is to see all of these ministers of the gospel. It's a marvelous picture. Who is it that is supposed to articulate the longings and aspirations of the people more than the preacher? Somehow the preacher must have a kind of fire shut up in his bones. And whenever injustice is around, he must tell it. Somehow the preacher must be an Amos. He said, when God speaks, who can but prophesy? Again with Amos, let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. Somehow the preacher must say with Jesus, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me. And he's anointed me to deal with the problems of the poor. And I want to commend the preachers under the leadership of these noble men, James Lawson, one who has been in this struggle for many years. He's been to jail for struggling. He's been kicked out of Vanderbilt University for this struggling, but he's still going along fighting for the rights of his people. Reverend Ralph Jackson, Billy Kyle, I could just go right on down the list. As time will not permit, but I want to thank all of them. And I want you to thank them. Because so often preachers aren't concerned about anything but themselves.
Yeah, we see a lot of that today.
I'm always happy to see a relevant ministry.
Yeah.
It's all right to talk about long white robes over yonder and all of its symbolism. But ultimately, people want some suits and dresses and shoes to wear down here. It's all right to talk about streets flowing with milk and honey. But God has commanded us to be concerned about the slums down here and his children who can't eat 3 square meals a day. It's all right to talk about the New Jerusalem, but one day, God's preacher must talk about the new New York, the new Atlanta, the new Philadelphia, the new Los Angeles, the new Memphis, Tennessee. This is what we have to do. Now, the other thing we'll have to do is this. Always anchor our external direct action with the power of economic withdrawal. Now, we are poor people. Individually, we are poor when you compare us with white society in America. We are poor. Never stop. Forget that collectively, that means all of us together, collectively we are richer than all the nations in the world with the exception of 9. Did you ever think about that? After you leave the United States, Soviet Russia, Great Britain, West Germany, France, and I can name others, the American Negro collectively is richer than most nations of the world. We have an annual income of more than $30 billion a year, which is more than all of the exports of the United States and more than the national budget of Canada. Did you know that?
And mind you, those
That's
numbers are
powerful
tripled
right
today.
there, if we know how to
Tripled today.
We don't have to argue with anybody. We don't have to curse and go around acting bad with our words.
Nope.
We don't need any bricks and bottles. We don't need any Molotov cocktails.
No.
We just need to go around to these stores
Listen to the suggestion.
and to these massive industries in our country and say, God sent us by here to say to you that you're not treating his children right. And we come by here to ask you to make the first item on your agenda fair treatment where God's children are concerned. Now, if you are not prepared to do that, we do have an agenda that we must follow. And our agenda calls for withdrawing economic support from you.
The late, great Dr. King.
So as a result of this, we're asking you tonight to go out and tell your neighbors not to buy Coca-Cola in Memphis. Go by and tell them not to buy sealed test milk.
Listen.
Tell them not to buy what is all the bread, Wonder Bread. And what is all the bread come to Jesse? Tell them not to buy hard bread. As Jesse Jackson has said, up to now, only the garbage men have been feeling pain. Now we must kind of redistribute the pain. We are choosing these companies because they have been fair in their hiring policies, and we are choosing them because they can begin the process of saying they are going to support the needs and the rights of these men who are on strike. And then they can move on downtown and tell Mayor Loeb to do what is right. And not only that, we've got to strengthen black institutions. I call upon you to take your money out of the banks downtown and deposit your money in Tri-State Bank. We want a bank-in movement in Memphis. Go by the Savings and Loan Association. I'm not asking you something that we don't do ourselves in SCLC. Judge Hooks and others will tell you that we have an account here in the Savings and Loan Association from the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. We are telling you to follow what we are doing. Put your money there. You have 6 or 7 black insurance companies here in the city of Memphis. Take out your insurance there. We want to have an insurance in. Now, these are some practical things that we can do. We begin the process of building a great economic base. And at the same time, we are putting pressure where it really hurts. I ask you to follow through here. Now let me say as I move to my conclusion that we've got to give ourselves to this struggle until the end. Nothing would be more tragic than to stop at at this point in Memphis. We've got to see it through. When we have our march, you need to be there. If it means leaving work, if it means leaving school, be there. Be concerned about your brother. You may not be on strike, but either we go up together or we go down together. Let us develop a kind of dangerous unselfishness. One day a man came to Jesus, and he wanted to raise some questions about some vital matters of life. The points he wanted to trick Jesus and show him that he knew a little more than Jesus knew and throw him off base. Now that question could have easily ended up in a philosophical and theological debate. But Jesus immediately pulled that question from midair and placed it on a dangerous curve between Jerusalem and Jericho. And he talked about a certain man who fell among thieves. You remember that a Levite and the priest passed by on the other side. They didn't stop to help him. Finally, a man of another race came by. He got down from his beast, decided not to be compassionate by proxy. But he got down with him, administered first aid, and helped the man in need. Jesus ended up saying this was the good man, this was the great man, because he had the capacity to project the eye into the thou and to be concerned about his brother. Now, you know, we use our imagination a great deal to try to determine why the priest and the Levite didn't stop. The times we say they were busy going to a church meeting, an ecclesiastical gathering.
Too busy.
And they had to get on down to Jerusalem so they wouldn't be late for their meeting.
Too busy.
At other times, we would speculate that there was a religious law that one who was engaged in religious ceremonial was not to touch a human body 24 hours before the ceremony. And every now and then we begin to wonder whether maybe they were not going down to Jerusalem, down to Jericho rather, to organize a Jericho Road Improvement Association. That's a possibility. Maybe they felt that it was better to deal with the problem from the causal root rather than to get bogged down with an individual effect. But I'm going to tell you what my imagination tells me. It's possible that those men were afraid.
Listen to this.
You see, the Jericho Road is a dangerous road.
There's a lesson in what he's about to say next.
I remember when Mrs. King and I were first in Jerusalem.
Man, oh man.
We rented a car and drove from Jerusalem down to Jericho. And as soon as we got on that road, I said to my wife, I can see why Jesus used this as the setting for his parable. It's a winding, meandering road. It's really conducive for ambushing. You start out in Jerusalem, which is about 1,200 miles, or rather 1,200 feet above sea level. And by the time you get down to Jericho, 15 or 20 minutes later, you're about 2,200 feet below sea level. That's a dangerous road. In the days of Jesus, it came to be known as the bloody paths. You know, it's possible that the priest and the Levite looked over that man on the ground and wondered if the robbers were still around. Or it's possible that they felt that the man on the ground was merely faking. And he was acting like he had been robbed and hurt in order to seize them over there, lure them there for quick and easy seizure. And so the first question that the priest asked, the first question that the Levite asked was, if I stop to help this man, what will happen to me?
Listen to this. Listen to
Then the Good
this.
Samaritan
Here's
came
the
by,
life lesson right here, man.
and he reversed the question.
Man.
If I do not stop to help this man, what will happen to him? That's the question before you tonight. Not if I stop to help the sanitation workers, what will happen to my job?
Right.
Not if I stop to help the sanitation workers, what will happen to all of the hours that I usually spend in my office every day and every week as a pastor? The question is not if I stop to help this man in need, what will happen to me? The question is, if I do not stop to help the sanitation workers, what will happen to them? That's the question.
That's the question. What an honorable man, the late, great
Let us
Dr.
rise
Martin
up
Luther King.
tonight with a greater readiness. Let us stand with a greater determination. And let us move on. In these powerful days, these days of challenge, to make America what it ought to be, we have an opportunity to make America a better nation. And I want to thank God once more for allowing me to be here with you. You know, several years ago I was in New York City autographing the first book that I had written. And while sitting there autographing books, a demented black woman came up. The only question I heard from her was, "Are you Martin Luther King?" And I was looking down writing, and I said, "Yes." The next minute I felt something beating on my chest. Before I knew it, I had been stabbed by this demented woman. I was rushed to Harlem Hospital. It was a dark Saturday afternoon. That blade had gone through, and the x-rays revealed that the tip of the blade was on the edge of my aorta, the main artery. And once that's punctured, you're drowned in your own blood. That's the end of you.
That's right.
It came out in the New York Times the next morning that if I had merely sneezed, I would have died. Well, about 4 days later, they allowed me, after the operation, after my chest had been opened and the blade had been taken out, to move around in the wheelchair in the hospital. They allowed me to read some of the mail that came in, and from all over the states and the world, kind letters came in. I read a few, but one of them I will never forget. I had received one from the president and the vice president. I've forgotten what those telegrams said. I received a visit and a letter from the governor of New York, but I've forgotten what that letter said. But there was another letter that came from a little girl, a young girl, who was a student at the White Plains High School. And I looked at that letter, and I'll never forget it. It said simply, "Dear Dr. King, I am a 9th grade student at the White Plains High School." She said, "While it should not matter, I would like to mention that I'm a white girl. I read in the paper of your misfortune and of your suffering. And I read that if you had sneezed, you would have died. And I'm simply writing you to say that I'm so happy that you didn't sneeze." And I want to say tonight say tonight that I too am happy that I didn't sneeze, because if I had sneezed, I wouldn't have been around here in 1960 when students all over the South started sitting in at lunch counters. And I knew that as they were sitting in, they were really standing up for the best in the American dream and taking the whole nation back to those great wells of democracy which were dug deep by the founding fathers in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. If I had sneezed, I wouldn't have been around here in 1961 when we decided to take a ride for freedom and ended segregation in interstate travel. If I had sneezed, I wouldn't have been around here in 1962 when Negroes in Albany, Georgia decided to straighten their backs up. And whenever men and women straighten their backs up, they are going somewhere, because a man can't ride your back unless it is bent. If I had sneezed, if I had sneezed, I wouldn't have been here in 1963. The black people of Birmingham, Alabama, aroused the conscience of this nation and brought into being the Civil Rights Bill. If I had sneezed, I wouldn't have had a chance later that year in August to try to tell America about a dream that I had had. If I had sneezed, I wouldn't have been down in Selma, Alabama to see the great movement there. If I had sneezed, I wouldn't have been in Memphis to see a community rally around those brothers and sisters who are suffering. I'm so happy that I didn't sneeze. And they were telling me, now it doesn't matter now. It really doesn't matter what happens now. I left Atlanta this morning, and as we got started on the plane, there were 6 of us. The pilot said over the public address system, "We are sorry for the delay, but we have Dr. Martin Luther King on the plane, and to be sure that all of the bags were checked, and to be sure that nothing would be wrong on the plane, we had to check out everything carefully, and we've had the plane protected and guarded all night." And then I got into Memphis, and some began to say the threats, or talk about the threats that were out, or what would happen to me from some of our sick white brothers. Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead, but it really doesn't matter with me now, because I've been to the mountaintop. I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over, and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land.
I think that's an honorable way to close out the celebration of an incredible human being, our king, not just a king to the black community, but he's a king for all of those, regardless of your nationality, regardless of your religious persuasion, regardless of where you are on the earth. He represented civil rights. More importantly, he represented human rights. He was our king. And with that, we salute the late, great, honorable Dr. Martin Luther King. Long live the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King. With that being said, I thank all of you who stayed with me this long. I really appreciate that if you did that. And I am your host, Charles Chandler. This is another episode, another show of Let's Talk About It Now. I look forward to getting before you within probably tomorrow. Until then, you have a fantastic and productive and positive and safe day tomorrow and throughout the duration of this week. Shout out to all of you that joined me tonight and stayed with me in my Facebook group. I appreciate you. And with that being said, have a fantastic night, folks. Good night.